Hello, and welcome to Module 2, where we are going to start our journey of learning about rehabilitation counseling and mental health counseling this semester. I hope you guys are able to access everything just fine and know each other a little bit better after Module 1's introductory discussion post. You'll see that this week we've got a couple articles to read that talk about the history of rehab counseling, and then we're going to be talking about some laws within our discussion post. So I get kind of geeked out on this area because the history of rehab counseling I think is so unique in terms of where our profession came from, how it is that federally mandated job. I mean, how many other jobs does the federal government say, this is something we think is important, and this is something that needs to be here, and we're going to enact some laws around that. And because of the disability rights movement that underlies all of the laws that are out there. So there's a lot that goes into the history of rehabilitation counseling as a profession. And a lot of it is, of course, disability rights history and the progress that we've made up to this point, and where we can still go from here. So you're going to find in this class that we are going to be talking a lot about historical events, about specific dates, about specific laws and policies that have been enacted. I encourage you, if I haven't put notes up, lecture notes, take your own notes in addition to maybe the lecture notes even. We'll get to a couple weeks down the road, there's going to be some lecture notes where you really have to be kind of keying in and looking at specific laws independently rather than me just providing you with the information. The reason that I structure the course in this way is because I want you guys to be prepared for the exams that you may be taking at the end of this graduate degree program, namely the CRC exam, where you will have to know certain dates and certain laws that have been enacted that benefit people with disabilities and work to promote the employment of people with disabilities. So yeah, it's kind of like a history class. It just is. But I hope that I can make it as entertaining and as interesting as I possibly can, and that I can kind of show you all how exciting this field is, and the amazing amount of potential you have with a degree in rehabilitation and clinical mental health counseling. So that's my little spiel for now, but let's look at the history, right? So rehabilitation counseling history goes back well beyond the 70s, of course, okay? But when the 1970s hit, what did we see in the rest of the world, the rest of the country, right? This was that time where there was the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement, all these social justice forces were coming together and enacting change within our society. And so in the 1970s, we saw a lot going on in terms of disability rights and things happening and occurring within populations of people with disabilities. There were a growing number of people with disabilities in this country in the 1970s. Really, if you think about the medical world and you think about the wars that were in the early 1900s and how kind of progressively as our capabilities to keep people alive improved, right? As the medical world improved, we were keeping more soldiers alive, returning more soldiers home after wars, but soldiers had disabilities, right? And so we kind of hit this threshold where there was an increasing number of people with disabilities in the country, veterans coming back from wars who weren't able to perform the jobs that they were in prior to being deployed and going and fighting for our country. And now they're coming back, and it was basically a collective, what the heck are we going to do with all these people that deserve an opportunity to thrive and become employed? What should we be doing about this? And so that's where rehab counseling essentially stems from, as the federal government acknowledging that they needed help and assistance, and they needed to have people that were trained in the disability aspect of employment, and there to assist people that were coming back from wars that had sustained injuries, that had lost limbs, that had lost their sight or hearing or a combination of things, and helping these veterans get back into jobs. So the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement laid that foundation and laid the traction for the disability rights movement. And so those activists that were consumers, so individuals with disabilities, kind of looked to the civil rights movement and the key players in the civil rights movement and pulled some of the tactics from them. Individuals with disabilities started questioning really if services were being provided in their best interests. And at this point, we're working from a medical model, okay? And so we had doctors and counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists and all those people saying, hey, we're going to really help you, but you're going to do what I tell you to do. And this is what you're able to do. And we determine that as medical providers, not you as the person. And so collectively, individuals with disabilities in the country said, you know what, we know what's best for ourselves. And so we're going to get together and we're going to become a force within ourselves to make some laws, enact some change in the country. And deinstitutionalization came around this time, later 70s, early 80s. We saw a lot happening with that as well. But really, the most notable piece of legislation that you will continuously hear about throughout this program, and if you're working in state VR right now, you've already heard about it, is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So this law has been around for a long time. And what that means is that it's been amended a lot of times. And so you will see throughout legislative history that with the amendments came, sometimes significant changes, sometimes marginal changes in how we interpret the law itself. But mainly, there were 5 major mandates in the Rehab Act of 1973. One was that the federal government agreed that there was going to be service provided to individuals with severe disabilities. Consumers needed to be involved in the process. That's the second mandate. Program evaluation had to be done. So the services that were being provided to individuals with disabilities needed to be evaluated. Are they working? Are we spending the money as taxpayers? Is our taxpayer dollars hard at work, literally, with the Rehab Act? So is the money paying off? Are people becoming employed? Are the services being provided working? Support for research, of course, and we'll talk about evidence-based practices in this class and in other classes that you're in, but we're never just kind of, doing our jobs willy-nilly as rehabilitation counselors or mental health counselors, right? It's always informed by something, and research is part of that. And of course, the Rehab Act was hoping to advance the civil rights of individuals with disabilities. If you can make some time in your lives with the course loads that you have, I encourage you to watch some of the documentaries that are out there on the disability rights movement, on the people, the key players during that period of time in the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s leading up to the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is amazing the sacrifice that people made to ensure that these laws were enacted at a time where people with disabilities, quite honestly, were locked away in different facilities, away from their families, away from society, and that was about it. That they were just left there and nobody gave a second thought to it. And even as we moved into the 80s and the 90s, there was still a lot of resistance to integrating individuals with disabilities in our communities and in our schools. And unfortunately, we still do see this today. I mean, we just do. More so in other countries than we do here in America. And of course, we continue to make advancements in our understanding and acceptance of individuals with disabilities and the value they bring to our communities and our society. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So the Rehab Act of 1973, here on slide 4, if you're following along with the slides, I'm not going to go over exactly what it states. If you have to kind of go from the basic level and understanding the 2 main pieces of legislation that are out there that apply to rehabilitation counseling and mental health counseling. One is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is the federal sector. The other is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was originally enacted in 1990. So that's the private sector, okay? So Rehab Act, federal, ADA, private. And we're going to be talking about the Rehab Act today and in our discussion board as well, okay? So the Rehab Act has different sections underneath of it, right? So there's this big law and different sections, and each section's a little bit different, and they tell you how it applies to people out there in the world, right? Sections 501 and 505 are the sections of the Rehab Act that apply to employees, federal employees, anybody that's employed federally by the government. And what 501 says is that federal employers cannot discriminate against federal employees with disabilities have to make accommodations, things of that nature. Under Section 501, federal employees have the right to request reasonable accommodations in the workplace. They have the right to go through dispute resolution processes. They have a right to file a claim of discrimination against their federal employer. So 501 and 505, because that talks about remedies and attorney's fees. So basically, if you're going to sue the federal government, you can't just sue them for like $1 billion. So there are caps to certain things, but so if a federal employee feels like they're being discriminated against, essentially they would be claiming discrimination under Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I encourage you to look into the different links that I provided within the slides as well. It gives you a little bit more detail about each of these sections of the Rehabilitation Act. I say encourage for this stuff because I can't force you to do this. So welcome to the lovely world of online learning. I put information and resources out there for you guys. I hope that you look at it. I cross my fingers and, say little prayers, but, it's up to you if you actually review this information or not. It is absolutely valuable to you. Why? Because you're going to be working with people someday, and these people are going to be discriminated against, and you are the person that will have the knowledge to say, I learned about a law that said your employer can't do that to you back in my first class in my master's program. Let me go back and see that information, and let me try to be an advocate for you or with you so you can get your rights met. So please look at the additional links. Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act applies to contract workers. Basically, anybody that's does have a federal contract, which is like a lot of people because the federal government gives out a lot of contracts. However, they have to be in excess of $10,000. Again, those federal contracts have to take affirmative action and employ individuals with disabilities and not discriminate against individuals with disabilities, right? Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, it talks about people can't essentially be discriminated against in participating in federally funded programs because of a disability or because of disability status. So if there's something out there that's funded by the federal government, let's say schools, right? Schools get federal funding. And so when we think about a 504 plan for students with disabilities, this is where it comes from. So entities that are funded by the federal government, programs that are made available to the public, all of those programs have to be accessible to individuals with disabilities. Section 508 requires that federal agencies make their information accessible. This includes electronic information and extends to the internet. So if you go on federal websites, and if you are a person with disability who uses assistive technology, which is any kind of technology that helps somebody do a task or perform a job in just a little bit of a different way. So if somebody is using a screen reader or a screen magnification program, then all the federal agency sites, websites that are out there, application materials and whatnot, are accessible for that type of technology. And there are different regulations around that and what that actually looks like. So the Rehabilitation Act, depending on the section that you're looking at. So if you notice that like Section 501, I've got a link to the EEOC. EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they are the enforcement agency for different laws. 501 and ADA are the two main players of that one, along with another a handful of other different laws that we'll learn about in a couple weeks. But when somebody says, I am protected under a law, laws in and of themselves are pieces of paper, and so there's no like Rehabilitation Act police force that's going to come and get like an employer or a restaurant or facility for discriminating against somebody. They're enforcement agencies. So we've got the EEOC, we've got the Department of Labor, and these agencies are the agencies that people go to file complaints of discrimination. The agencies assign people to investigate them, and they follow up, and the course of action proceeds from there. So that's important to know too. There's not any entity that's just going to come knocking on somebody's door because they discriminated against somebody or a client of yours with a disability. You have to go through a complaint process. Now, looking at slide 9, if you are currently working in the state vocational rehabilitation system, or if that is your goal, phenomenal. You have likely then heard a lot about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, which is a relatively new piece of employment-related legislation that, in effect, amended the Rehab Act of 1973. So we'll be talking about this periodically throughout the semester. I'll be bringing up transition services. There were a number of different rules that were implemented as a result of WIOA, which was enacted in 2014 under Obama. Mainly, the intent of this act was to help coordinate agencies that provide services to marginalized and disenfranchised populations of individuals. And that does include individuals with disabilities. And so there are all these services, community services, public services that are available to people under a certain socioeconomic status, individuals with disabilities, different race categories, minority categories. And what was happening is that these agencies potentially could have been providing services to one client, all of them could, but there really wasn't a lot of communication in between the agencies. They weren't working together to provide the maximum amount of services to an individual, or they weren't coordinating services in terms of getting somebody to the right place. And so this law, really the intent of it is to help streamline the process, get people where they need to be. Agencies now have to take additional steps to measure and report performance. Employer partnerships are really emphasized under WIOA, where agencies and people that work for agencies like us, like rehab counselors, are encouraged to go out, hit the pavement, make those connections with employers so that we can advance employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Not only are we hoping that people secure jobs, but we want to get our clients into competitive integrated employment, employment where there's room for growth, employment opportunities where it's not just somebody, at that entry-level position for 15 years. So there was an increased focus on VR services in that way, vocational rehabilitation services in that way. Transition services also have a massive increased focus under WIOA, with state VR systems being mandated now to spend a certain percentage of their funds on transition services. Now, transition services, what are those? So those are services to students with disabilities. And so at age 14, any student with a disability is provided with pre-employment transition services. What that means is that we're basically engaging a team of individuals to help ensure that that student doesn't just graduate and not have any other opportunities or options available for them after that fact. So we're hoping that we're preparing our students with disabilities to seamlessly go from high school to either additional training, education, technical programs, or into the world of work, transitioning them right into the VR process, and ensuring that, again, they're going to be maintaining competitive integrated employment. So there are other notable events before the 2000s, of course, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into rehab history later on, but other things that happened before the 2000s, and I can't believe we're in 2019, so 2000 is like a while ago. But the independent living movement was notable. There are a lot of disability rights acts that came out. You'll probably notice some of these are more recognizable. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, we've heard of that. The No Child Left Behind or Every Child Succeeds Act in 2015. These applied to children with disabilities. There are changes to Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, every now and again, although it doesn't tend to be an increase in the amount of money that's being given out as a benefit. But I just kind of wanted to present slide 11 to you to help you understand the different types of laws that are available and that are out there. Because, again, for this week's discussion, what I want you to do is pick from one of the 4 laws that I have presented to you in the discussion post. So I want you to look at either any of the amendments to the Rehab Act after 1973, Social Security Disability Insurance, IDEA, or WIOA. So pick one of those four. Look up articles about that law. See what happened after it was enacted. See what people are saying about it. Did the law work as it was intended? What are the benefits to people with disabilities? What is your just general perception of the law itself? And it's an informal discussion, so I'm not requiring you to cite anything. If you want to, you can. But so get in there, take a look at the laws that are out there that are part of the foundation of rehabilitation counseling in our profession, and engage with each other as you go along throughout the week, okay? And I'll see you next week.